sort of the Arab awakening. These are historic times, trust me. Anyone who follows the Middle East, this is as historic as the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after World War I. It's comparable to the Berlin Wall coming down. So you had, prior to the demonstrations in Libya, you had the revolution in Egypt, the largest Arab country. You had the fall of Mubarak, relatively peacefully. I mean, I think a total of 800 people died, largely at the hands of the secret police, but the army did not get involved. That's a big deal. That's a very, very big deal. You had Tunisia, that preceded Egypt, and that ignited the protests in Egypt. Now, you got Egypt here and you got Tunisia here. What's in between them? Libya. Libya is the bridge between those two countries. I would imagine, look, I was not in the room when the president decided this. None of us were. But I would imagine that anybody who knows the Middle East that was briefing him would tell him that what happens in Libya can affect the success or the failure of the revolutions in Egypt and Tunisia. Now, Tunisia may not be as important, but Egypt is really important. I mean, that is the anchor of pro-Western, moderate Arab politics in the Middle East. Now, maybe after this revolution, it may not be as pro-American as it was, but it's not, we're not talking about Iran here. But Egypt has certain elements that we have to hope won't take power. Now, a lot of this is out of our hands, but you have to at least try to direct things, if you possibly can, in a direction that is most advantageous to U.S. interests. So while, yes, it's true that if you take the view that Mr. Fisher does, that you cannot go to war without some authorization from Congress, and that if you're going to go to war, as we did with Libya, and I would say that firing Tomahawk missiles into Libya from off the coast is an act of war. I think you have to consider, you can look at that through the world of legal documents and treaties, which I'm not saying that they're not important. They provide order in the world. But there are more things going on here than just the War Powers Act. There is U.S. foreign policy considerations in the broader Middle East, which have to be taken into account. I don't know how you quantify those, but you do have to take them into consideration.
Thank you. I think the President's letter, as well as his address, indicated two things for the action. One was stability of the region, but the larger issue was really the possible humanitarian disaster that would ensue if there were a massacre that did take place. And I think the three players, at least by some reports, that were most influential were those who were around at the time of Rwanda, and that weighed heavily. There is a big guilt thing carrying forward. And I'm talking about Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, and Samantha Power, who was writing about it at the time. Let's take questions. Please give your name and identify yourself, and let's start out with the young lady next to Marty Tulchin.
Oh, I need a mic? Okay. I have two questions because I don't know if
Give your name and affiliation, please.
Oh, I'm Sue Tulchin. I'm a professor at George Mason University, and I'm going to ask two questions because I don't think you're going to call on me twice. One question is, and I think I know we've used Lou's books, and you've all done very fine work, but my question is, didn't Congress, by passing the War Powers Resolution, violate the Constitution in a way? Because they have the right, only Congress has the right to declare war. And by this, what I think is a really ridiculous piece of legislation, they're giving themselves 60 days. You mentioned the 60 days. You can blow up the world in 2 days. So giving themselves a 60-day period is, and it seemed ridiculous to a member of the public like myself. And secondly, I'm a child of the Vietnam era, and it seemed to me also that if you had required, if Congress was really doing its job and upholding its responsibility to declare war, you might have had more public support for this particular war. Has anyone done a study really correlating in recent times the growth of executive power and the unpopularity of wars? Because I think Vietnam was the first war that I remember, and I remember the War of 1812 very well. But I think that we've had a series of unpopular wars, protests. Aside from Kucinich, you've had massive protests, and I just wondered if anybody has correlated that.
Let me just say about the War Powers Resolution, I think it's a fundamentally dishonest statute. When you're passing a statute, you have to make a compromise between the House and the Senate, and you go to conference committee, and if something says 90 and something says some other number, you can do something in the middle, you're not violating the Constitution. But if you look at what the House did and what the Senate did and what came out of conference committee, it was, as Senator Eagleton said, a bastard. Because Section 2 of the War Powers Resolution says that this protects the framers' intent and also ensures collective judgment. Obviously, it doesn't do that. As Sue said, it opens the door for presidents to go to war on their own for up to 60, 90 days, and nothing could be worse or more far afield from the framers' intent, or it has nothing to do with collective judgment. So it's a very dishonest. I think Sue knows that, of course, this came at the end of the Vietnam period, and members of Congress are trying to assert themselves, and the press, Marty, I think, made a mistake by saying, yeah, they're asserting themselves. No, they're surrendering their powers. But I think members of Congress felt under pressure to do something, and this is what we got. It's a terrible, terrible statute.
I can talk about the Vietnam. I mean, I agree it's a bad statute for other reasons, obviously, by putting a 60-day clock on. But I agree with you. If you had the pro-Congress view, as I think of it, then why can Congress delegate its authority to the president, right? So, although I would say that we tolerate those kinds of delegations in lots of areas of domestic life. Who sets mile per gas limits on cars, right? That's Congress's power, but they give it to the executive branch in the Clean Air Act a long time ago. So one question is actually the delegation more unconstitutional than a lot of the other ones we allow to go on every day? On Vietnam, I quite take your point. I think even if you had my view, you would still want to get congressional approval. And when I was in OLC, we did recommend the president, as a political matter, get approval for Afghanistan and Iraq. And there's this weird phenomenon where the Congress asked us to draft the statute for them, authorizing the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And then this did not happen in the House, it only happened in the Senate. When I went around and visited senators, the major theme I heard was, why are you making us vote on this? They didn't want to vote on the Iraq war if they could have helped it. So I think the president actually more often than not would like to get congressional approval. I'm sure President Obama would love to get congressional approval for Libya, but he can't get it. Congress, just the political incentives are such they don't want to vote on it for the reasons Mr. Goss gave. Vietnam, I think, is different. I mean, Vietnam, I'm not sure. I mean, there are many people who criticize war powers as it works today who think Vietnam was constitutional because of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So you did have a statute. Now, some people say Lyndon Johnson lied to Congress to get them to pass a statute, but Congress had passed a statute. But then every year there were, significant increases in the military voted by Congress and appropriations, the size of, right? So the president and Congress agreed on Vietnam for a long time, and Congress acted every year, and they could have easily stopped Vietnam. And how did the Vietnam War end, right? Congress cut off funding, and the war ended like that. So I think even in Vietnam, Congress had plenty of constitutional checks. I think sometimes we confuse lack of political will for some kind of constitutional defect. I don't think there's a constitutional defect, just the House and the Senate didn't want to use the ample powers they have in Vietnam. That's my sense.
Yeah, let me just add one part of your question relating to, is the War Powers Resolution itself unconstitutional? Of course, Nixon said it was, and that's why he vetoed it, but for a different reason than you indicate. But I don't think the statute really says that the president can do anything he wants for 60 days because the Section 2 that Lou mentioned just says that the constitutional powers of the president, commander-in-chief to introduce troops into hostilities or imminent hostilities may only be exercised pursuant to a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack upon the United States, its territories, or its armed forces. So it doesn't just say the president is authorized for 60 days to go anywhere he wants and do anything he wants. He can only exercise those powers pursuant to one of those three things.
I throw one last thing about the resolution I forgot to mention. I think if Obama doesn't withdraw this Friday, correct me if I'm wrong, Lou, he would be the first president to actually be clearly in violation, because even in Kosovo, which was the first time the president went beyond 60 days, even in Kosovo there was a special appropriations bill, and the Clinton administration said, by passing that bill, giving us money, you've approved it. So this is really interesting. This Friday will be the first real test if a president's just going to say, I'm going to blow through the 60 days, and Congress has done absolutely nothing to approve it of any kind.
Then on your other question, I think when we look at Vietnam, and yes, since then wars have been generally unpopular, but I don't think the intensity has been the same since we got rid of the draft. This gentleman right here, Emily.
Thank you, Fred Tipson. I was chief counsel of the committee when the Marines went into Lebanon in 1983, and Mac Mathias said, what can I do to get a vote? I think there's a misunderstanding about the purpose of the War Powers Act. The purpose of the War Powers Act is to make Congress register its will. It's a problem of political will that Congress wants to avoid. And my question is, why doesn't that procedure provide precisely what you want to have happen? You want to give the president power to act in an emergency under his judgment. We've given him a triad of nuclear weapons to act in emergencies on his own judgment. But where he acts without authorization, we want Congress to come in and say, do we agree with this or not? Now, the problem with the War Powers Act is that it would be unconstitutional to say that a no vote would require him to remove the troops. But as John said, this is a political matter. You want Congress to stand up and say, are we with you or are we against you? The War Powers Act provides precisely that procedure, and it puts it in order. Both houses of the Congress have to vote on it. They can't run away from it. And that's what Mathias did. Unfortunately, the Congress voted to support that particular action. They probably should have voted against it. But Congress registered its view. That's what you want. That's all you want. It have a significant effect on when presidents decide whether they're going to go or not, if they know they're going to have to face a vote after the fact. And it would have effect on the electorate and people's judgment. Constituents want to know, where do you come down, Congressman, on this issue? Senator, do you support the president or not? This procedure allows it. It's not unconstitutional. Use it.
Every president at election time will say, I'm not about to send American troops into a war. Woodrow Wilson did that in 1916. FDR did it in 1940. Lyndon Johnson did it for sure in 1964. So presidents know going to war is not a signal to send at election time. And the problem with the War Powers Resolution, if Congress, after that period, has to act, once the president engages in a military activity, Libya or anywhere else, all the arguments that we all know will come up. You can't cut off funds without men and women in combat. And the silly comments will be made by members of Congress that our men and women as soldiers will lack clothing and food and so forth, ridiculous arguments. So once you allow a president to go out there, take the initiative, your opportunity as a legislative body is pretty well taken away.
Well, this is crazy. You've already authorized this incredible national security state, pre-positioned commands throughout the world. You're saying Congress has not provided the president with the obvious tools that they want him to use in the case of an emergency or where he thinks the national interest is at stake? What you do want is Congress to say in any given situation, we don't like that one. Now, he doesn't have to pull out it when they say no, but he's in a much different position under those circumstances.
Yeah, the strongest position for Congress is when the president has to go and get authority, and if Congress doesn't want to do anything, which I think is his prerogative, obviously, it doesn't have to do anything. So that's a strong. But once you
run
have
away
to act,
from this vote, it's in order. You have to vote on it. It's before both bodies. There's no
we'll
way to
see
run.
if you have to vote. I think technically, in terms of the statute, I would agree with you, but I don't think it's going to work that way. I don't think you can force Congress to do anything it doesn't want to do.
They already pre-authorized it in the rules. It takes precedence in both houses, so they have to vote.
We'll see.
Porter?
No, I was just going to say there is a congressional response to this, and it's usually I was against it before I was for it. I was for it before I was against it. And that covers all the bases. And members of Congress don't want to be painted into a corner about events they cannot foresee. It isn't going to work because they'll do a workaround. I absolutely assure you there is more energy spended. I can tell you the master of the rules here can find you more ways to get the impossible accomplished.
Yeah. Consent can have it, but, and they've given it to him generally because, even when it wasn't authorized by the actual statute, because they wanted a debate, they wanted people to have an outlet, and so he did get a vote. But it could have been blocked just as easily. This gentleman right here.
Andrew Rohr, open source intelligence researcher in the DC metro area. I thought a lot of the questions that were brought up today were very important. One of them kind of cradles between what Mr. Broder and what Director Goss brought up, which is the practical aspects of, everyone can, at the end of the day, say, Congress should do this or Congress should do that. But the practical reality is, that they might not do anything. The question I have, particularly with regard to this matter, is when we killed Osama bin Laden, it was done without any congressional authority. It was done because the president viewed it as being vitally important to U.S. interests that we take care of the matter. Often, when we engage in conflict, there's always a large debate in the media as to whether we should engage or whether we shouldn't engage. And I think that detracts from the president's ability to go and do as he knows best because of all the intelligence that has passed to him. My question now being, to what extent should the media, to what extent should we entertain dialogue about the moral dilemmas of engaging when the reality is if action isn't taken early enough, we're effectively cutting our own legs from being able to act. So my question is, should we continue to allow mass dialogue to occur, or should action be taken earlier rather than later? And this basically confronts the Libya situation where the rebels had basically driven into Tripoli, and we probably would have had a good opportunity to take care of Libya, but then we waited for Congress and the UN to basically, we had to wait on their call.
Okay, for bin Laden, I don't know of anyone, I have not heard one person say that congressional authority would be required to go after suspected terrorists. No one, to my knowledge, argues that way.
I would just say that we have a free press here, and people can say whatever they want as long as it sells advertising.
I'm going to try to get into the Title 10, Title 50 distinction because it's sort of critical on the Pakistan issue. And it's sort of critical to what's going to happen tomorrow morning when the next situation like this comes along. If we get lucky enough to get good intelligence on, or because our professional people will get good intelligence on more high-value targets. And we're talking about a couple of different things here. But I would say that what the president did under the way they conducted the operation on UBL, as I understand it, and I read the papers, I don't know the inside stuff, was he used his Title 50 authorities with a lawful finding that had been appropriately notified to Congress. Now, that was supported by Special Operations Forces under Title 10, but the delegated authority under Title 10 went to the Title 50 authority, which was superior in this matter, and the president was covered by the finding on this. What's different about Pakistan? It's the first time in living memory, my living memory, where the operation, the covert operation, is called a covert operation for a simple reason. We never admit our fingerprints or we did it. There's always plausible deniability. Well, within 3 seconds of the time Obama was dead, everybody put their hand up. I did it, my credit, good for me. So this is not a covert action with plausible deniability when you play it that way. So what we have now done is we have taken a tool which we used to call a covert action fight, with a very good arrangement between the defense people and the intelligence people to take action on actionable targets, and we have now screwed up another mechanism which we're going to need tomorrow morning, and that does concern me a great deal, and I'm surprised nobody's brought it up.
Just wanted to
Yeah, the
Just
gentleman,
Okay, just wanna-
oh, yes, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just want to say, I think the legality of the strike is based on the 9/11 resolution that was passed on September 18th, because it doesn't say the president is authorized to conduct military activities in Afghanistan. He's allowed to attack any group responsible for the 9/11 attacks, right? So it's not limited to geography. So I think Osama bin Laden would clearly fall into that. The second point about covert action, I just wanted to pick up more of what Mr. Goss said and relate it back to the question from our veteran from the War of 1812. I didn't catch your name. But actually, I actually think the covert action area is an example where you might like what has happened because, right, it's unclear who has the authority to authorize covert action in the first place. I think Thomas Jefferson is actually the first president who authorized some kind of covert activity against the Barbary pirates. It's a very interesting historical episode. He did it on his own. He asked Congress for a pot of money, and they gave it to him, and then he didn't tell him what it was for. And he went off and I think he bribed an uprising in one of the Barbary pirate states.
But John, there were 10 statutes, right, for
I'm not
Jefferson.
done yet. I'm not done.
Okay.
No, but
Okay.
he had to get the funding from Congress for it. I mean, but the thing is, the way the covert action system works, I think, is actually a good example of congressional presidential cooperation that is very process-oriented, that doesn't lead to all the recriminations we sometimes get about war powers, I think, for interesting reasons. So Congress has to receive some kind of finding that Mr. Goss referred to get a covert action somehow blessed by Congress. But it's all built, if I remember, on the funding power. Congress basically says you don't get any money for a covert action unless you tell us about the finding and we somehow don't override it or disapprove it. And that system seems to work in a much more harmonious way than war powers. It just seems to me it's a good example of Congress can do all this if it wants to. If it wanted to write a war powers resolution that worked, they could do it because there's already a model for it. Last thing I want to just say about the moral dimension is, I think that's Jonathan's point. I think he's quite right that all our focus on the legal issues distracts from the policy choices and the moral choices. And one thing, having been the subject of this in a much smaller way than Mr. Goss has, I think that sometimes in the United States we allow these arguments about legality to detract from what's a good policy for the United States, what's a moral choice for the United States, right? So something's legal doesn't mean you should do it morally, and maybe something's illegal, there might still be a good moral case to do it, but right, we get tied up so much in legality, we tend to ignore whether the Libyan war is actually a good war for the United States, which is really the basic question.
Mr. Goss had a follow-up, and then Lou had something to say.
Well, all I wanted to say is that obviously when you're dealing with sovereign nations or territories that are sort of set out and we understand what we're dealing with, it's one thing. But when you're dealing with a group of people that are wandering around like nomads in some places looking for sanctuaries and finding mischief, then you have this real problem. How do you bring some kinetic response to control them without getting into a sovereign situation of a war-like act on another sovereign nation? And that's the beauty of the Title 10, Title 50 operation, but it's no darn good if everybody's saying, oh, yeah, those were our bombs. Because that really does, we used our military to drop bombs in a foreign country. How would we feel about that? Not so good. We used our military to put our troops to go down and snatch a guy. How would we feel about that as Americans? I mean, we have trouble with NATO overflights here. Imagine how we'd feel with boots on the ground doing that to American citizens. Well,
Okay, one point about the Barbary War is it's a good example where Jefferson did go into the Mediterranean and there was military activity. And when he came back, he knew the difference between offensive and defensive. He came back to Congress and he said what I did over there, and then he said, in his words, beyond the line of defense, I cannot go, and anything of an offensive nature must be authorized by Congress. So Congress passed 10 statutes for Jefferson and for Madison, and there's a senator, I won't name him, but when Clinton wanted to go into Haiti in 1994, the senator said, of course he can, because as Jefferson did with the Barbary Wars. And I wrote a 6-page paper at Congressional Research Service explaining what Jefferson did. And I talked with the senator's staff and so forth. And then a year later, Clinton wants to go into Bosnia, and the senator's on the floor says, of course he can, as Thomas Jefferson did with the Barbary. So it's not as though these studies I do have any impact.
One more point, John, here, and then we'll take your
I
question.
think the Barbary Pirates thing, though, the first attack by Jefferson on the Barbary Pirates was not authorized. Would you agree with that? Because he, in fact, I think you say he might have lied to Congress about it. Because no, you don't, because he had a statute which authorized naval training exercises, right, for 6 frigates, and Jefferson secretly ordered them to attack the Barbary pirates, which they did. And then afterwards, he reported to Congress that our peaceful fleet had been attacked by the Barbary pirates, right? And so I actually think it's an example of a president acting without congressional authorization at the initiation of the war, but Congress then authorizes it later.
Let's debate the pirates of the Wilson Center at the reception afterwards. We have time for one more question.
Okay,
Please
Frank,
identify yourself.
Yeah, Frank Fletcher, former Army Artillery. There's a couple of parallel issues. I'm thinking of the U.S. Army Special Forces in 1983 in El Salvador. They were allowed to be advisors, but they could not actually fire their weapons. Could they go on a mission to help direct, but not actually engage in firing? And then the dust up over the discovery by some people in Congress of ISA, the Intelligence Support Activity for Delta Force. Some people believe that they were actually potentially could have been used to do operations and not just collect intelligence. And that goes to the broader issue of categorizing things not as covert action but as something else, so that, well, you get my drift.
You recall that our Vietnam experience started with military advisors.
Advisors under Kennedy, right.
We have a great debate in the military about peacekeeping operations and what I would call humanitarian relief operations, and using our troops and our equipment and our capabilities, extraordinary as they are, to help out mankind around the world. So we're not talking about a warlike situation, even though our uniforms may be there with boots on the ground and so forth, but they're there on an errand of mercy or something that has nothing to do with combat. So that's a very distinctly different question, and usually it involves being invited in by the sovereign nation. Usually this is not done without their willing, or, well, at least their diplomatic approval of coming onto our territory. Because the sovereign territory is the sovereign territory. And yes, we help out in lots of ways and use our military to do that. Doesn't mean that we are doing it against the will of the sovereign. It means we're usually doing it with the will of the sovereign of that territory. So that's a critical factor. Covert action, reason we have plausible denial is because we don't want to have the discussion about upsetting the sovereign territory. I mean, it's very clear about that. And so I would say that we don't want to give up the tool, because the types of things we are being asked to do around the world these days, whether or not the resolution going back to September of 01 cover it or not, and that battlefield debate about whether it only applies to Pakistan or Iraq or Afghanistan or wherever it applies to, or does it all these guys, or does it involve the homeland who? It matters, because when you read that little book that John brought out, the Constitution here that we have here from the Heritage.
This one's from Hillsdale.
Wherever it came from. There are similar versions around available. The issue, and it says quite often in there, except at time of war or in times of war, things change. And so it's very important to know whether you're at war or not. And we took this question at the beginning of my conversation and said, are we at war or not? We're split. Half the people here think we're at war, half the people we're not. So imagine how Congress feels about that, because they represent us. There's probably half of Congress feels that way and half doesn't. It's probably a very good reflection. So I'm interested in the tools to deal with the problem. That's where I'm coming from today. We are all talking about trying to work out the moral questions and the separation of powers and a balance. I'd love to have the roadmap. I bet every president would love to have the roadmap. And it would be wonderful if Congress could react normally, regularly, dependably, and reliably. Ain't going to happen.
Well, we've arrived at the appointed hour. That is the last word. Please join me in thanking our panelists. You all are invited to a reception outside this room, and we can continue our conversation.
I fell apart, so I got this new one last year.
Yeah. I was a foreign correspondent for the